Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. We're broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd like to thank all of you so very much for joining us here tonight. I think we have a real treat in store for you. We are here, naturally, to celebrate the publication of this particular book, Take Me Outside, Running Across the Canadian Landscape That Shapes Us, by Colin Harris, published by our good friends at Rocky Mountain Books. And I'd like to sincerely thank everybody at Rocky Mountain Books for helping to, well, not only for publishing the book, but also for helping bring this evening together. Though it is unfortunate that we can't gather in person tonight, it's actually quite delightful to be able to welcome so many people from across Canada and beyond into this event. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. If you're watching this on YouTube, hello. If you're watching this on YouTube in the future, hello again. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. I'll be introducing tonight's host and then getting out of your way. There'll be a bit of a conversation, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of Colin. So as questions occur to you over the course of the evening, please feel free to write them into the Q&A box that you'll find right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't worry, you won't interrupt the conversation if you do write anything in there, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat itself. I'll be copying that and sending it along to Colin at the end so he can see all of your pleasant reactions to anything that he happens to say today. And then otherwise, I believe we're going to get underway. The only other thing I will point out, in the spirit of shameless capitalism, is that copies of Take Me Outside are available from McNally Robinson Booksellers, and I'll put all the information you need to order a copy for yourself in the chat as soon as I disappear. But first, I'd like to introduce your wonderful host for the evening, a very good friend of the store. Joanne Kelly is a former broadcast journalist who now teaches journalism in the creative communications program at Red River College. She is also hovering immediately to my side. She talks books on the Weekend Morning Show on CBC Manitoba and writes book reviews for the Winnipeg Free Press. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Joanne Kelly.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad that we're here to talk about this book. As a runner and someone who is the outdoors means everything to me. This book was fabulous, and I'm excited to talk about it. As I sit here in my porch outside, if it gets too loud, let me know. But I want to introduce Colin, and I feel like I know him from reading this book, but I am going to read a little bit of just so I make sure I get everything right, because Colin's the founder and executive director of Take Me Outside. And of course, he ran across Canada. But Take Me Outside, and we'll talk about this in our interview, but it's about getting kids away from the screens and learning outdoors, not just being outdoors, but learning, growing, connecting outdoors. So we're going to talk about that as well. But Colin has been in the field of outdoor and environmental education for more than 15 years. He has his master's in environmental education and communication, and we're going to end up talking more about what Colin does. And so I want to jump right in with Colin and say hi. And Colin's going to start with reading a little bit from his book. So we'll get right to it. Colin.
Thanks for having me. I just want to say a huge thanks to McNally's and John for setting this up. And Joanne, thank you for hosting this tonight. I'm looking forward to chatting with you. This always feels a little bit awkward, especially over Zoom, but I am going to just start by reading two short sections of the book, an introduction, and then I'll share a little bit more after that. For many, there's a sense of pride in being called Canadian. For others, it's a label that doesn't resonate. It's become tainted or even rejected. There are numerous issues that divide us and make us different from one another, be it politics, socioeconomic status, cultural background, or even gender. But what unites us? What binds all of us who live in this country together? Exploring what it means to be Canadian helps to tell the story of this country. It is these stories that help shape our history and culture, or rather histories and cultures. As this country is discovering, some of these stories aren't easy to tell. They involve pain, misgivings, and decisions that have proved harmful. But working through these stories can help make our collective identity as a diverse country stronger. The common ground that connects us all is this land we're so fortunate to live on. Our geography shapes us, not only as human beings, but also as a nation. Our identity as Canadians is rooted in our relationship with the land and the time we spend outside. And then jumping forward, this is in the heart of central Newfoundland, in the middle of February as I'm running. Each morning I woke to the sight of my breath hanging in the sub-zero air. I lay cocooned under layers of sleeping bags and blankets with Kuna curled up close by. Although a husky, she pined for my body heat as much as I needed hers. Peeking my head out, eyes still heavy with sleep, I developed an acute sense of how cold it would be when I crawled out from my blankets and into the day. Attempting to look out into the frosted windows of the RV was futile. I already knew it was a sea of white. My desire to expose more than just my face to the frigid air was equal to my desire to lace up my shoes and run 40 to 50 kilometers. But establishing routines was paramount to reaching the Pacific Ocean. I was learning to reject all the what ifs. What if I just sleep for another half hour? What if I take the morning off and run this afternoon? What if I take today off and maybe tomorrow's weather will be nicer? What if I just can't do this anymore? As the layers of cold, damp running clothes hit my skin, I was jolted awake. On the single burner stove, I toasted bagel slices and lathered them with half-frozen peanut butter. The 41 kilometers I would run that day were a drop in the ocean. Victoria was still more than 7,000 kilometers, and I predicted 250 parking lot sleeps away.
Colin, there we go. There's so many threads I want to talk to you about on this, and whatever I don't cover, I'm sure will be covered in questions. I want to start little picture before we get to the big picture of why you did this. You started with the run through Newfoundland, which I have to say was probably my favorite part of the book. I'm, as a runner, living in Winnipeg, running in -40 in a snowstorm, I would much prefer over +40 and the heat. So I want to start kind of in the microcosm of running and the Canadian landscape. Running across Canada, what did it do to your soul and psyche to like just to see all this weather, all this landscape? How did that impact you?
I mean, I think, you know, it was twofold. It was probably, you know, like everyone else, I mean, there were lots of days where, you know, we're all affected by the weather in this country. And so there were many days, especially in the winter, where I had no desire to go out and run. But I think, you know, I speak to part of it in the book. I mean, I think it's tough sitting behind a computer screen all day. And I think that was one of the joys of running across the country, is that I got to wake up every day and just be outside. And honestly, it didn't matter sort of the weather. I mean, you know, we can all dress appropriately when we need to. But yeah, I think sort of it helped form that relationship with the elements. And you know, essentially my job became being outside every day and doing this running. So although there were days where I had no desire to run, I think at the end of the day, I always felt sort of rejuvenated, and although tired, but you know, I think I felt like it was a day that was well spent.
Well, you use the word joy, and as someone who tries to spend as much time as possible outside, I get that word joy. And when I think about winter, again, you know, I live in Winnipeg, which is probably, you know, the coldest capital in Canada, but the -40s, the snow, it makes me feel alive, and it makes me feel connected. And I think connection is such a huge part of your book. So I want to talk. I want to talk connection with the landscape. I want to talk connection with people, with individuals, with classes. But let's start a little bit again with the connection with the environment. Like your descriptions as you go through each province, honestly, Colin, made me want to run across the country. Let's talk. If you could talk a little bit about how you felt connected across Canada as you went through each separate province and separate landscapes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I was younger, I think my parents for a birthday gift gave me a book by Pierre Burton called The Joy of Writing. And if I remember correctly, I'm going to have to paraphrase, but lots of people think about traveling outside of, like, traveling to somewhere foreign.
Yeah.
And I think Pierre Burton sort of honed in on the joy of exploring your own country, and especially this country, Canada. And I think, growing up, I had the opportunity to move around a little bit with my family. And although that was tough at moments, transitioning from city to city, it also made me really appreciate this country that we live in. And so, yeah, I mean, I think when I did the run, I mean, Newfoundland just has sort of a real beauty to it. It's also admittedly the people who live in that province, but the landscape is, I think near the end of the run, in the western part of Newfoundland, you have mountains on one side and the open ocean on the other. And that's consistent with every part of this country. I mean, I think regardless of where you live in this country, we're so fortunate to have the access to the outdoors that we have, even in major city centers. Part of my sort of youth was spent in Toronto, and the green spaces that exist even in the heart of that city are pretty amazing compared to a lot of other cities around the world. So yeah, I mean, I won't spend time going through every province in terms of the highlights, but I mean, I just, I know most people sort of live in urban centers, and more so that's becoming a reality. But you don't have to, I mean, even within those urban centers, you have access to beautiful green spaces that are part of this country. But I think beyond that, if you have the means to sort of get out of that city, there are some amazing spots in this country to visit.
A couple things I want to say to that is, for those watching who haven't read your book yet, one of the things I love about it is the description you give, not only of the beautiful countryside, but the parks within the cities and the beautiful things within, Fredericton or Thunder Bay. You give a really, like, it feels like as a tourist book. If you want to tour your own country, this would be a fabulous book to read. But I want to talk about connection, and I want to get to the bigger connection with students. But what I really also took from this book was the individual connection that you got along your run. There's parts where you talk, especially when you first started running, where you had to make a point of connecting with drivers and, I'm here, see me. But you made a lot of connections with people along the way, and those individual connections are obviously just as important as the big connections, which we'll talk about. How important were those little individual connections?
Yeah, with individuals, they were paramount. I mean, I think, I talk about the school visits, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. But every chance there was an opportunity to sort of connect with students or connect with individuals. I had lots of friends who stopped on the side of the highway to say hi. I had a couple people who would run with me for little stretches. And it seems weird to have, like, these random conversations as you're running on the side of the Trans-Canada Highway with transport trucks passing you at 120 kilometers an hour. But, those small connections were really unique. I mean, I think the story that comes to mind the most was actually someone I hadn't met before, but it was in sort of Northern Ontario, and crossing paths with Jean Beliveau, who was sort of in his final stretch of walking around the world for the past 11 years. And he was doing a stretch from Vancouver to Montreal, and there was no traffic. We were in the middle of nowhere, Northern Ontario. And, having that 20 minutes to interact, two individuals, and just tell our stories was sort of one of the highlights in terms of what you're speaking to, in terms of that connection with individuals across this country.
And the connection with individuals, you made so many connections with individual students and teachers. And you share in your book some of the emails and letters and things that students have said to you. Can we talk a little bit about how important, we're going to talk about Take Me Outside, but just the idea that you connected with thousands of young people who are just beginning, right? How important were those connections?
I mean, they were paramount. I mean, I think it's, you never know the impact that you're having as you make your way across the country. But, when you get these letters and these pictures that students are drawing, that's precisely what fueled me across the country. And I think it's, again, it's, they're fleeting moments. You go into a school, I would go into a school and do a presentation, and you'd have an opportunity to maybe afterward, after sort of a big gymnasium presentation, chat with, a few students individually. But, I think it's, those connections were really important. They were probably more so important just to fill my cup a little bit, and keep me going across the country. And then, in terms of inspiring students, I mean, I think they were always on the same page. I mean, whenever I would chat with them about screen time and our time outside, they had all the right answers. And I think, they could definitely buy into what I was trying to sell, in terms of spending a little bit less time in front of screens and a little bit more time outside. But yeah, I mean, there were some individual students who definitely sort of had an impact as I went. I think of a student in Calgary, with a school visit I did, and he wasn't the best behaved student in the classroom, but for some reason he latched onto this run across the country and really took an interest. And it was kind of cool to exchange some emails, and that teacher sort of kept him in the loop for the rest of the run in terms of, the daily occurrences and mileages and the stories that were happening. So it was kind of cool to connect with students in that way. And I think that's, I think there was probably a moment where, and I can't pinpoint when it was, but I think, I had this personal dream of wanting to run across the country, and I had it since I was a young teenager. And I think there came a point in the run where I realized this wasn't about me anymore. It was about something bigger. And I think that's where, I think that's probably what I'm most proud of is sort of forming those connections with teachers and schools and students across the country, and having this run across the country be something bigger than just about a personal achievement.
And the impact, again, that you have no idea the impact you're going to have on an individual student, but as a whole, I think we have to talk about the fact that this book is coming out at just the perfect time, during a pandemic where families are at home and they're having to socially distance, and being outdoors is a huge answer to a lot of especially the mental health issues that we're having during this pandemic. So in terms of students being outdoors, this isn't just about go outside and play. This is a bigger issue of schools transforming the way they teach. And I've seen some schools pick up on that. What would you like to see schools, students learning and doing outdoors?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question with no easy answers. We're sort of rooted in this education system that has a bit of a history to it, at least in terms of, the last 150 years of formalized education. But, I think I try to talk a little bit in the book about sort of, that's a fairly small window of education. There's this bigger, Indigenous people were educated for thousands of years on this land, and they did it outside. And I think there are opportunities, and there's a growing number of schools and teachers across the country who are committed to that. And so I think it's, yeah, it's all the research too is, and I don't want to dwell on the research too much, but there's a growing body of research that really sort of speaks to how beneficial it is for students to spend that time outside. Actually, I got an alert this morning of a new research paper that came out. It was grade 5 students in North Carolina. And I'll try to summarize quickly, but the essence of it is that these grade 5 students who were learning science had better grades and were more engaged in that science when they learned outside experientially as opposed to inside the classroom. And I mean, there's lots of research that sort of speaks to these benefits. And so, yeah, I think we're in a time where outdoor learning sort of ended up being a bit of a solution when COVID first started, to having students still be at school, but trying to do it outside. And so, I think the $1 million question is, once COVID is sort of over, what happens with these students? And I think part of the work Take Me Outside is trying to do is just really sort of advocate for and support teachers and schools to realize that learning environment can extend beyond sort of 4 walls and a desk.
I mean, I think about growing up, outdoors for us at school meant, a 15-minute recess break where you probably spent more time putting your snowsuit on than you actually did playing outside. But what I loved about your message is it's not just about playing outside. It's not just about putting the screen down. It's about incorporating the outdoors into what we learn about our history, about our landscape, about connections with people. And bottom line, what do you hope, especially teachers and parents, take away from Take Me Outside, from what you guys are trying to do?
I mean, I think it's really twofold. I mean, I think the organization, I did the run across Canada, and this is still a prescient issue in terms of screen time. So, when I did this run 10 years ago, it was to try and really chat with students about spending less time in front of screens and more time outside. There was a growing body of research at that time that was talking about that screen time affecting young people's physical health. And we know that that's just sort of been augmented over the years and spilled over into our mental health, our emotional health. And so part of the work we do is really focused on that screen time piece and trying to address that in some way. But I think with that connection with schools, we've tackled that directly by sort of advocating for outdoor learning, and trying to work with teachers and schools to say, hey, a student doesn't necessarily, and it's not to, I want to make sure it's not to pit sort of inside versus outside. I mean, there's a time and a place for the classroom and the structure of a classroom, absolutely. But I think through this research, there's an ability to extend that learning environment. And again, there's numerous examples across the country, but I think, we're seeing more and more teachers who are committed to, like, a math lesson doesn't have to be done at a laptop or with pen and paper. I mean, it can be done out in the schoolyard. And so it's finding ways to give teachers the resources, the tools to do that, but also the teacher's commitment to sort of spending that time outside. And, teachers are up against a lot. So sometimes there's a lot of red tape just for a teacher to be able to go outside. But that's part of the work that Take Me Outside is trying to advocate for.
In terms of being outdoors, I want to ask you about your run, because we chatted a little bit before this conversation, and probably one of my favorite parts of the book is that I'm technically a runner because I've run marathons and half marathons and stuff, but I'm not a runner in that the science means nothing to me. I don't train. So what I loved about your run was how open you were about, you were running for the joy of it, right? You weren't worried about the technical gear, about nutrition, about calories. And how important is that message to share, that just get out and do it?
Yeah, I mean, I might fall into the minority here, but I do feel fairly opinionated about it. I mean, I think, you know what, if like if a smartwatch or having your GPS on or whatever, like if that gets you out, that's great. I think when I've had conversations with those people over the years who use those devices, you know, I think there's a shelf life sometimes to those devices. And I think, I don't know, for me, there was a period in my late 20s where I got a little bit more serious about running and I trained hard for some half marathons. And for sure, you know, you're doing intervals and you're using
Oh,
that watch a little bit more. But but I dropped that pretty quickly. And I think for me, running was almost, it was just sort of a sanctuary. And I talk about in the book, you know, it was a space where I could go to either reflect on something that was weighing on me, but on the flip side, it was also an opportunity just to go out and clear my head. And so I feel like, you know, running has so many benefits, but it's yeah, I think the joy of running. I mean, I've had so many friends who have said they're not runners,
yeah.
and I think that conversation shifts a little bit. I mean, you don't need to be a runner. Um, you know, I think that's what I enjoy. And it sounds like you do too. But I mean, I think even just getting out for a walk, you know, I think the last example I'll leave on this question is, you know, we've all gone down that rabbit hole of, you know, scrolling through our phones and sort of doing this deep dive into whatever we're sucked into, whether that's on social media or something else. And all of a sudden you've spent 20, 30 minutes, uh, you know, immersed in your phone. And, you know, often there's a sense of regret that comes after that, or a feeling of wasted time. And I think regardless of whether you go for a run or whether you go for a walk or a bike ride, and it doesn't matter what the weather is, you know, I contend strongly that you never come back in from half an hour outside and regret that time outside.
Colin, that is one of my favorite expressions, like my friends and I use whenever we're trying to push each other to go for a run, is that you never regret a run. You never, no matter how much it takes to get out of the house, you never come back from a run and go, I wish I hadn't done that, right? Um,
Exactly.
so I want to talk again, and I know some of the questions that are coming are about landscape as well. Um, you have you go through each province and you describe a little bit about how it impacts you, but overall as Canadians, I really liked how you touched on the history of Canada, what it means to be Canadian, reconciliation, and the idea of ownership of the land. How important was it for you to delve into kind of the history of what it means to be Canadian?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I'm not going to have a good answer to that because I feel like I'm constantly uh, learning. Actually, I'm just reading a book now by Adam Grant called Think Again. And it's about this idea of rethinking and unlearning. And I think as Canadians, we are having to unlearn some of the things that maybe we grew up with. And that's, it can be difficult. And this book sort of outlines, you know, he shares research in terms of how difficult it can be to either rethink something or unlearn something. Um, so, you know, it's not, you know, there's a hope to do some more writing on this, and involve others, but I think, yeah, I just think we, you know, sometimes we sort of, we like to explore this idea of Canadian identity. Um, and hopefully I'm going to use, so I am a Winnipeg Jets fan. Um, and I've listened to a lot of sort of interviews with Paul Maurice over the last couple of years. And he consistently talks about team identity and how important that team identity is to sort of the success of the team. And I think I've started asking myself, you know, how important is our Canadian identity in terms of the success or the story that we're telling as Canadians? And I think, you know I just used a hockey example, but it sometimes feels as though we lean on some of those cliches of, well, we're a hockey country, or we're a polite country, or we're a country that really likes Tim Hortons. But I think more and more trying to explore this notion that regardless of where you come from or how long you've lived in this country, that's the one thing that unites us, is this land that we live on. And I think it's, trying to explore some of that a little bit deeper, is the work that I'm focused on personally, of reading more writing from Indigenous writers, and hearing those stories about their connection to the land. And I think there are lessons to be learned for sure.
You've mentioned Winnipeg and the Jets, and I just have to say, as an aside, as someone who moved to Winnipeg like 20 years ago as an adult, and it's become my home, I can get very defensive about Winnipeg, and I love how open you are about how much you love Winnipeg, because it's not only is it a fabulous city, but I moved here from Vancouver. So I'm driving through the mountains thinking, well, the mountains will be the highlight of my trip, my drive. And I hit the prairies and I fell in love with the fields and the sky and the shadow of the clouds on the field. And I know there's questions here as well on this. Is it possible to have a favorite part of your run, or a favorite part of your landscape, or is it just, I don't even know if that's a fair question.
Yeah, I mean, the favorite parts are sort of divided up. So I do have several favorite parts, but I think, I'll try to answer a little bit of that. I mean, my friend Sarah left the run just sort of in central Ontario in Huntsville. And so I was 5 weeks sort of alone until my dad joined me just east of Thunder Bay. And that was probably one of the more trying 5 weeks of the run, because I was on my own. I had to hitchhike back to the RV. But it was also one of the more rewarding 5 weeks of the run. And I think running along those shores of Lake Superior, for sure, was one of my favorite parts of the country. And then, I guess, I feel like Winnipeg is in my blood a little bit. And, my family still lives there. And so I'm eager to come and visit them when it's allowed. But yeah, I mean, I think the prairies are really underrated. And, but this is consistent with all parts of the country. I mean, it goes back to sort of how fortunate we are to live in this country, and to have the landscapes in all the different provinces and territories across the country. I think and being committed to explore that landscape. I mean, my parents, over the course of the last year during COVID, when it's been allowed, they'll go for a Sunday drive, and they try to explore. They'll pick a direction and leave Winnipeg, and later they'll email the family with a few pictures. But they try to they really are committed to getting to know that province. And they've seen some beautiful landscapes, beautiful scenery. And, I think somewhere in there, I believe that when you sort of strengthen that relationship with the outdoors, with nature, it begins to shape who you are as an individual. And it might sound cheesy, but I think when you strengthen that relationship to the natural environment, it makes you a better human being.
I fully agree with that. And I've been trying to spend the last couple of years exploring Manitoba, but certainly during the pandemic. And I'm curious on your thoughts on, and I get that you're not a scientist, but the outcome of the pandemic. I see so many more people exploring the outside, but I also, there's so much talk of resiliency, especially with kids. And I'm thinking, what a lesson in resiliency when I think of all, like, especially with your RV, right? Like all that you had to go through to run across the country. what are you hoping, especially children, will get out of this in terms of resiliency and making your dreams come true?
I mean, I think, kids know what to do. I mean, kids love spending time outside. Maybe people on this call will have watched a lot of TED Talks. One of the top TED Talks is Ken Robinson's How Schools Kill Creativity. And in it, he sort of gives that example of all kids sort of have that creative instinct when they're small. Drawing is a consistent part of those early years. And for some reason, as we grow older, we get less and less, or a lot of us get less and less creative. We don't put that pencil to paper. We don't put that paintbrush in our hands. We lose some of that creativity. And I feel like that's almost the same with our relationship with the outdoors. Kids love playing outside. You can put, a kid outside in a park or in a grassy forested area or wherever, and they will make their own fun for hours on end. And somehow as we get older, we lose that. And so it's not so much, I think it's not so much the kids that have to sort of focus on this issue, it's the adults. And I think, we're role models. And I think we have to sort of role model that relationship, that connection with nature, with the outdoors, to the kids in our lives, whether as parents or just, role modeling that for, whether it's an educator, whether it's a parent. I don't have kids of my own, but I certainly try to role model that for the kids who are immersed in my life.
I don't want to open it up to questions because there's a few here, but I need to quickly ask about another connection in the book. Kuna. My dogs are, again, just like running and being outdoors, especially during the pandemic, my dogs are my joy. So if you could share a little bit about what it meant to bring Kuna on this trip with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably mostly dog people who get other dog people. So, all the cliches. I mean, for sure, Kuna was my best friend, and there was no question that I wasn't going to leave her for 9 months of doing this cross Canada journey, and then reunite with her at the end. I mean, she had to sort of come on this journey. So, bless her, she survived 9 months in the RV. Sarah helped out with walking her when she could. She didn't get as much time outside as maybe it was just tough to, I would have loved for her to run, although she was a lazy husky. So she wouldn't have run I couldn't have her on the Trans-Canada Highway anyway, but, years when I first had her, I think in the first 2 years that I had her, we tried to do a skiduring race when I lived in Ontario, and it was a 7-kilometer race, and she maybe ran in front of me for a kilometer, and then I dragged her for 6 kilometers. So no, that relationship was pretty special. I mean, she was sort of, my listening ear.
And she got to sleep with you at night. She must have loved that.
Yeah, exactly. It was a lot of good bonding time.
I want to start looking at some questions here. And this is a great question. And you talk about it in the book, but I think it would be important to share here. It's from the Jap family in Saskatchewan. And they're asking about the impact the Terry Fox Memorial had on you. And I know that that's in the book, but it is for all Canadians such a huge impact.
Yeah, I mean, there were sort of two defining stories that sort of helped develop this dream of wanting to run across the country. One was the Olympic torch relay for the 80 Olympics in Calgary. But the other was Terry Fox. And I was a bit too young to sort of fully recognize his story when he was doing his Marathon of Hope. But just as all Canadians learn, I learned his story. And yeah, I mean, there was a monument sort of in St. John's that I got to sort of visit on my first day. And then, but yeah, definitely one of the most special moments was when my dad joined me just east of Thunder Bay. And then we arrived at the Terry Fox Memorial, just outside of the city of Thunder Bay. And yeah, that's it's definitely a personal moment that I got to share with my dad that I'm extremely grateful for. There was one other family there that day, and sort of a little girl who asked some questions, and I think my dad had to respond for me because I was in tears. But yeah, that was definitely, I mean, I think, whenever I talk to students, most of the students that I've talked to have already learned the story of Terry Fox. And, I think I say, I never wanted to duplicate, obviously, what Terry Fox did, but I certainly wanted to try and emulate him. He inspired so many Canadians, and I think that's, that was part of my story of him inspiring me and my desire to do this. And yes, I did it for sort of a different reason and a different cause. But I think in different ways, so many Canadians have been inspired by his story, and they've gone on to do great things because of what he did for that Marathon of Hope.
And it's got to be pretty impactful to know that you're inspiring people, kind of like these kids you're meeting.
Yeah, I mean, definitely not something that I'm comfortable with, but and I think I think more so it's the, and I don't mean this to sort of deflect, but it really is, in terms of the work that Time Outside is trying to do, it's the teachers across this country who are at the forefront. And I think they're the ones who are having that daily impact on students. And so it feels good to be able to contribute to that conversation. And, maybe along the way, you're able to inspire a couple students here and there. But I think it is that day-to-day work that teachers put in that is really inspiring, and has that sort of more deep and meaningful impact on students.
And that kind of leads to a question Tiffany has posted about what advice would you have, especially right now in a pandemic, with parents trying to, I mean, the connection through social media is actually important for kids, but getting them away from the screen. What kind of advice do you have for parents, teachers to get kids away and outside?
Yeah, this is always, in some ways it feels like a complicated question because there are so many layers to it. And then other times it feels like, there are really easy answers. I mean, I was just talking to a friend the other night, and sort of our generation, I mean, I think anyone sort of over the age of 30 would say that they grew up in a childhood where they just were outside a lot of the time. Their parents didn't necessarily know where they were. Obviously, we didn't have cell phones. No one was checking in. You were home by dinner, and then, I get a little bit tired of the cliche, but you were home when the street lights came on. And I know that we live in a different time, but I think I find it tough to answer sometimes. I mean, I think more of it's a commitment to really tapping into, for a lot of parents now, it's tapping into that childhood that you had, and in some ways recognizing the benefits that came from that, and trying to instill that in how you form that relationship with your own kids, and that connection to the natural environment. I don't want to say anything too contentious. I know that there are times where, and I think this is the world of media we live in. I mean, we lived in when we were growing up, you might hear the local news, but now you hear news from all corners of the world. And so as a parent, it can be pretty fearful to hear some of that news and want to protect your kids from some of that. And often that does lead to, that time outside, and especially that unsupervised time outside. So even though the research shows differently, it can be hard to, we all want to protect sort of our young ones. So, I mean, that maybe I'm skirting around that question a little bit, but
Well, I think it's interesting too that, and again, I keep coming back to the pandemic. It's just, I've seen triple, quadruple the number of people outdoors, right? When I'm out kayaking or running or cross country skiing. But what I'm noticing more is families out together. And so I think what your book touches on is not just being outdoors, but the connection. And I think for kids, there's probably something really special and important that they get to go outdoors with their parents. That the family time is now together and outdoors. So that connection really combines, I think, as well. That's not really a question, but
no, I agree. I think that family connection is super important. And I think it's, you know, as more of us move to urban centers, I mean, there's an equity and accessibility piece to this conversation as well. I mean, there are families who are fortunate to have homes with backyards, but in major city centers, I mean, there's numerous families who are living in condos or apartment buildings and don't have that physical, their own backyard. And so, you know, I think it's part of it is the way we frame this conversation. And I think for some families, it definitely is more difficult to get their family outside than it is for other families. And I think, you know, that's why city planning is so important in terms of those green spaces that are accessible within, you know, some of these neighborhoods that are more densely populated. So I think, yeah, but I agree that family connection piece is super important. And I think, you know, when you think back on your own childhood, it's, yes, you can think about, like, there are family homes and that family home can be important, but I think a lot of pivotal moments in childhood and growing up with your family actually happen outside. So yeah.
and you talk about accessibility, and I think it's so important. I've seen some stories here in Winnipeg about kind of libraries instead of books. It's you know, skis or skates, equipment that families may not have access to or being able to afford. And of course, you don't need all that equipment to be outside, but it certainly helps, right? I'm just reading a book, a question here from Haricott, you know, about outdoor learning, connecting students with nature. However, one can go outside and may still carry our baggage with us, Eastern versus Western, urban versus rural, white versus colors. So what is the one most important message you want a youth to remember when he or she grows up into adulthood and is in a position to change the future direction of this country? It's a big question.
That is certainly, yeah. I am not qualified to answer that question. Geez, I don't know. I mean, I think you just want, you know, I think you know that if you're sort of, whether it's a relationship with a family member or a relationship with a partner or a relationship with a friend, I mean, you need to put time and effort into that relationship in order for that relationship to grow and to become stronger. And I think that's no different than our relationship with the natural environment and the outdoors. I mean, you've got to spend time and effort and it does take effort sometimes to you know, put on your shoes and go outside, whether it's for a run or hike or a bike or whatever it is. It does take effort, but I think, you know, it's trying to bridge that gap of, we know what all the research is saying, you know, we know how beneficial it is for our physical health, for our mental health, for our emotional health, to build that stronger relationship with the outdoors. And so, yeah, I think my hope for kids growing up is that, you know, if you develop that strong relationship with the outdoors, it benefits you in so many different ways.
And that segues perfectly into a question from Louise, who's asking, how impacted your life outside of being outdoors? Your determination, your stubbornness to make it happen, how has it impacted you outside of the run?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helped me get through a lot. I mean, I did sort of a master's degree, and I am not an academic student by any stretch, but I think, writing that thesis, I said, if I can run across the country, I can write this thesis. And it was the same for writing this book. I mean, there were many days where, it felt like a struggle. But yeah, I think there is a stubborn determination that is grounded in this running across the country. And I think, people can sort of draw on that from their own life experiences. But yeah, for sure, running across the country has sort of given me, the confidence that even though things might not go swimmingly, a lot of the time, and again, it feels, I'm hearing myself say this cliche out loud, but you stick with it, and it's, you just stay persistent. And I think, you find different ways to stay persistent within whatever task or goal you're trying to achieve. But yeah, I think it's, my mother sent me an email recently, and she had to mark some papers for a course she's teaching, and she really didn't want to do it. But she had just sort of she had just finished reading my book, and she said, if Colin can run across the country and put in those hours every day, I can finish marking these papers for students.
And I'm in the exact same boat right now, so that's getting me through as well. There's a couple questions here about turning this into a kid's book. And I mean, certainly the book is accessible, like young kids could read this and get a lot out of it. But have you thought about turning this into a kid's book, or something kids can access, picture book?
Not yet, but if someone wants to help fund that, I'm all ears.
Well, there's a few people who asked about that, so I'm just scrolling through the questions, and a lot of it is just saying what an impact you've had on that. One quick question I wanted to ask you was about you personally. That was what, 9 months of running, and whether you had company in the RV or not, you were alone for a lot of that time. And it blew my mind when I realized that you weren't listening to music. Like, what did that mean for you? How did you cope with the loneliness in both good and, like, I'm assuming that helped you grow a bit, but how did you deal with the loneliness of the run?
Joanne, I'm going to take a guess, but are you an introvert or an extrovert?
Extrovert.
Yes. So as a self-proclaimed introvert, being alone is quite comfortable in my world.
Yeah.
So, and it's not to say, I mean, I think, there were parts in Northern Ontario during those 5 weeks where I really did feel alone. And, even as an introvert, I wanted a family member there, or I wanted to connect with my friends in a more meaningful way other than, a phone call or email.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, I've always sort of drawn strength from being alone. And yet at the same time, like, really value that social connection. Most of my friends who know me well know that I enjoy going and doing things out on my own. And when it comes to social time, I enjoy that social time, but somewhat limited in my capacity to enjoy it at length.
Yes. Well, I think part of what the introvert extrovert thing is, I mean, probably all of us have qualities of both, and I certainly have qualities of both. I recharge as an extrovert in engaging with people, but I also recharge on my own, which is why running is so huge for me. And there's so much to take away from your book, but I know I've said this already, but I loved the fact that you didn't count calories. You didn't worry about the shoes you were wearing and the science and the technology, because I say that to people all the time. Running is not about technology and science. It's about the joy of getting out there. So to me, that was one of the most important messages of the book. So I want to thank you for that. And I'm just looking to see if there are any other. Hi, Uncle. That Dylan saying hello. Was it difficult to process your experience? Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, the milkshake question is a good one. That the day where you were like, I have to get there before the milkshake stand closes. But how did you to be able to write a book 10 years later? You were blogging about it, I think, and writing about it. How did you, were you processing as you were running, or is it all done after?
In terms of writing this book?
Yeah, or even just the processing what you were going through at the time as you were, how much processing were you doing on the road? How much after?
Yeah, I felt like I was, yeah, on the 9-month journey, I felt there was that sort of a single focus and, well, a single focus of running each day and making it across the country, but also trying to have an impact on the schools I was visiting. Yeah, I was definitely a lost soul after that 9 months. You know, I ended up living in Victoria for a brief few months, and then moving to the Rocky Mountains. But yeah, I was definitely lost and feeling, you know, trying to find myself after sort of pouring, you know, all this time and energy into this lifelong dream. So it's yeah, and then I can't remember the other part of the question.
That's okay. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, you talk specifically about the media and storytelling, and my title is a journalism instructor, and I was a journalist for a long time, but I don't use that title. I use storyteller, and I think stories are important. So how important is your story, other people sharing their stories as a way to connect people? How important is storytelling?
I mean, it's what differentiates us from all other animals. So, you know, for my master's thesis, part of my research focused around storytelling. And there's Walter Fisher sort of did a lot of research around narrative paradigm. And I think one of my master's professors are sitting on this call, so I don't want to say this incorrectly, but you know, one of my takeaways in terms of storytelling was that some stories are more meaningful than others, in terms of how our history and culture are shaped. And I think for me, I'm still trying to process this a little bit, but you know, when I chat with students, I talk to them about, I give the example of movies and sort of comparing one movie versus another. And usually I compare a really bad movie to a really sort of meaningful and impactful movie, and ask them, you know, which is the more important story? And usually their answer is bang on in terms of that good movie. And I think it's the same with, you know, I think the story that I'm trying to tell and the story that I'm trying to live is that our connection with this land is an important one, and that if we can do that better, it will shape our history and culture in a more beneficial and significant way as Canadians.
And we've hit 8 o'clock, but there's 2 quick questions I want to get to that are on here. I think are great, fun last questions. And Stephanie wants to know, if you ran a few kilometers with anyone famous, who would it be and why? Though I got to say, I loved when you got to run with your dad. But if you were going to run with someone famous, who would it be and why? I'm going to say living or dead. Be someone from the past or the present.
This is oh, you're putting me on the spot here. Probably I'm going to go with, so I took music in undergrad, and I think it would be pretty interesting to run a few kilometers with Amadeus Mozart.
Love it. That's not the answer I was expecting. That's awesome. And the other part of the question, I'm going to put you on the spot here, is why?
I mean, you know, if you've read any of his sort of life story, he had quite an interesting life. And yeah, I think just I'm fascinated by some of these composers that created some of like this long-standing music that, you know, will never go away. It will live on sort of infinitely. And yeah, I think just trying to understand how someone's brain works like that to be able to compose music like that. I'm probably going to regret this answer after I get off this
I
call.
love it. Though I have this mental image now of you running along the Trans-Canada with someone in a big powdered wig and breeches and buckled shoes. And one final question here. And this is from Dale, who said he totally felt like he was on the journey with you. Oh, I love this. I would love to run with Stan Rogers. I was just talking about him today. Do you have any plans to continue writing?
Yes. What? I'm not, I've got a few ideas brewing, but yes, I mean, I think one of those sort of lifelong dreams as well when I was younger. I mean, English was my favorite subject in school. And, it's there's lots of room for improvement with whoever writes, but I certainly feel that way from my end. But yeah, there's definitely an interest to continue writing. About what though? It's a toss-up right now.
Well, I think that was a really quick hour. And as I said, as someone who is really learning to embrace the outdoors, and it's been like my saving grace, especially in the past year, I want to thank you for sharing this story. And I think I've answered all the questions. There's comments in the chat. But John, if you want to come back in, you think we are good. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Colin, and end on?
I mean, I'm just gonna, I just want to do a shout out to my nephew Dylan and my niece Shinray. And Shinray's actually been in the hospital for the last couple of weeks. And so I'm thinking of her and hoping she gets better. And yeah, and I can't wait to see my whole family and come back to Winnipeg.
We all can't wait for that moment we can hug our families, right? John?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joanne. And thank you, Colin, for such an incredibly fascinating and energetic conversation as well. As you pointed out, Joanne, that just kind of flew by. So thank you both so very much. Great thanks to all of you out there as well for all of your questions, all of your comments as well. I'll make sure that they get to Colin as well so that he could see them. There were some really lovely stories and messages shared. So we're very grateful to that and for your attention over the course of this evening. I will remind you the book is Take Me Outside, and it's available through McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can give us a call, you can visit us in person, and we deliver locally, nationally, and internationally as well. So we can pop one in the mail for you, regardless of where you might be. I'd like to thank Rocky Mountain Books one more time for making all of this possible and for always being so wonderful to work with. And end by expressing my extreme gratitude to Joanne Kelly and, of course, Colin Harris. Take me outside and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Colin.
you.